All right, well, we'll call the organizational meeting to order. And the first order of business will be swearing in the newly elected board members, alphabetically, challenging me with the names being so close.
Had to go to fourth letter, fifth letter.
Yeah, I had to go, keep going letters down. So first will be Mrs. Miller. If you would please stand. And we'll go with raise your right hand. Do you, Mrs. Miller, solemnly swear that you will support the constitutions of the United States and the state of Ohio, and that you will in all respects uphold and enforce the policies of the Ohio Department of Education and the Carlisle Board of Education, and that you will faithfully discharge the duties of school board member for which you are about to assume? If so, respond with I do.
I do.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Oh, yes.
I might as well hug you too.
I have two forms for you to sign. One you can keep, and one you'll get back to me when we get done.
Okay.
He'll get back for you. Are you
Secondly,
Missy or Melissa?
Kelly Milligan, Mrs. Milligan, if you would please rise, raise your right hand. And do you, Kelly Milligan, solemnly swear that you will support the constitutions of the United States and the state of Ohio, and that you will in all respects uphold and enforce the policies of the Ohio Department of Education as well as the Carlisle Board of Education, and that you will faithfully discharge the duties of school board member for which you are about to assume? If so, respond with I do.
I do.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Again, 2 copies. You sign one, keep. Sign one, give back to me when you're done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think now we can properly do the roll call.
Call the roll.
Mr. Jewell,
Present.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Here.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Here.
Mrs. Miller,
Here.
and Mrs. Milligan.
Here.
So I'll stand and do the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do you do this or do I?
I can run the meeting if you want.
Go ahead.
Next on the agenda is we'll take nominations for board president for 2020.
I would like to nominate Mr. Jewell.
So we have a nomination for Bill Jewell. Do we have a second?
Yes.
Second by Mrs. Miller. Do we have any other nominations? If not, we'll take a roll call vote. Any other discussion? Okay, Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
and Mrs. McIntosh.
Yes.
And lastly, Mr. Jewell.
Abstain.
In lieu of getting around the front here, I think I'll just stand aside.
Yeah, I gotta do this swearing in too.
You have to swear in too.
Yeah.
Raise your right hand.
I thought you was gonna go ahead and check.
Wait till we get done.
Okay.
Do you, Bill Jewell, solemnly swear that you will support the Constitution of the United States of America, the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge your duties as president of the school board in and for the said Carlisle Local School District in Carlisle, Ohio, to the best of your ability and in accordance with the laws now in effect and hereafter to be enacted during your continuance in your said office and until your successor is elected and qualified? If so, please respond with I will.
I will.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
And then we will
Sign that.
we'll sign that, and then we'll get the vice president to sign that whenever the vice president's elected.
Let's hug at the end. Save all hugs for the
Yeah.
end.
Since we have a president, we will now take nominations for vice president.
I nominate Tammy Langhart.
We have a nomination for Tammy Lanehart. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. McIntosh. Do we have any other nominations? If not, and there's no other discussion, we'll do a roll call. Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart.
Abstain.
I'll come around on the other side. Congratulations. Come over here. All right, do you, Tammy Lanehart, solemnly swear that you will support the Constitution of the United States of America, the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge your duties as Vice President of the school board in and for the said school district of Carlisle Local Schools in Carlisle, Ohio, to the best of your ability and in accordance with the laws now in effect and hereafter to be enacted during your continuance in the said office and until your successor is elected and qualified? If so, please respond with "I will."
I will.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And we'll have you sign here and then Bill will sign here. I just need copies at the end.
Okay.
And Tam will sign that one.
Oh,
Sign mine.
okay.
Whatever you interested, I think they're gonna sign us things. But there's something that's
Next on the agenda, do you want to ask for visitors' comments?
I still.
So do you want to
Oh,
ask for
this,
visitors?
yeah. At this time, do we have, is any visitors that wants to make a comment? I guess not. Okay, now what do we do here?
Okay, we'll move on to the action items then. So in your packet, we have the dates and times and location of the regular monthly meetings. We'll need a motion to approve those.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Langhart,
We need a second.
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 Second by Mrs. Milligan.
I didn't know that's what we're waiting on.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Next, we'll need the approval of our board member compensation, which is per the Ohio Revised Code, which is $125 per meeting. We'll need an approval.
So moved.
First by Mrs. McIntosh, we need a second.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Lanehart. If there's no discussion, Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell.
Yes.
Next is establish a service fund for the Board of Education according to the currently adopted appropriation measure, which is already in place. We'll need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Milligan, and we'll need a second.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Lanehart. If there's no discussion, I'll call the roll. Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
and Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Okay, our next item encompasses items A through S, which is basically standing approvals for the treasurer and the superintendent. If there is no questions or discussion, I'll need a motion to approve.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Lanehart,
Second.
second by Mrs. McIntosh. I'll call the roll. Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Next, we need an approval to join the Ohio School Boards Association for calendar year 2020.
So moved.
I missed that, was that
So moved.
Mrs. Milligan?
Milligan.
And we'll need a second.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Miller. No discussion, I'll call the roll. Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
and Mr. Jewell.
Yes.
And then in addition to joining the Ohio School Board Association, the next one is to join the Ohio School Board Association Legal Assistance Fund. We'll need a motion to approve.
So, go ahead.
So moved.
First by Mrs. McIntosh,
I'll second.
a second by Mrs. Lanehart. No discussion. Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan.
Yes.
Next is the tax budget, which was part of your packet. We had a hearing earlier today. And again, what the tax budget is a budget showing that the tax revenue that we collect from our constituents here in Carlisle Local School District is necessary and needed for the operation of the school, and it is reviewed by the county auditor. So that's essentially what you're approving. So we'll need a motion for approval.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Milligan,
Second.
second by Mrs. McIntosh. Any discussion? Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart.
Yes.
And then next, we'll need to come up with our committee appointments. So I will leave the discussion up to you all. Who wants to begin where? In parentheses is who was on the committee for last year. So we'll have 2 members that are no longer with the board, so we'll have to for sure replace those. And then any others that might be wanting to switch roles. So our legislative liaison was unanimously selected Molly McIntosh before she was here.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm a nerd like that.
Prior to her arrival,
We thought
She
it
was
was
selected.
for you.
Come late, there's it. A and D. A and D.
A, Andy. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
B,
know what
our
I don't know what
OSBA
D
delegate,
does.
will we keep it with Bill Jewell?
I don't
Yeah.
care.
That's fine. C, our alternate, OSBA alternate, we'll need a new person for that.
I can do it.
Kelly Milligan. D, our legislative local representative, I think I heard Molly McIntosh
Yeah.
was gonna do that as well. Our Warren County legislative liaison, currently is Tammy Lanehart. Keep that.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Curriculum, our 2 members were Molly McIntosh and Dale Moore, so we'll need a replacement.
I can do
Missy?
Missy? So we'll go with Molly and
Molly and Missy.
Missy Miller. Our maintenance, Bill Jewell. Our athletic council, we have Bill Jewell and Molly McIntosh. Our finance committee, Tammy Lanehart, and we'll need a replacement for our finance committee,
I can do
Do
it.
you want to be on there? Okay. Good.
Kelly. Our education foundation is Bill Jewell and Molly McIntosh. Our Lions Club, Bill Jewell. Our CERA representatives are Tammy Lanehart, and we'll need a replacement.
I can do it.
And that will be Missy Miller. Music boosters, we'll need a replacement.
I can do that one.
So that'll be Kelly. Our student achievement will need to be replaced.
I can do it.
Missy? And our lioness will be Tammy Lanehart. So just to go over them real quickly again before we vote.
Either one of you in the Lions Club.
Any of you want to be? That's,
Now we
wanna
have to join the
jump?
Lions Club?
now's your opportunity.
Just wondering.
We just try to get it. We just gotta have a representative with them.
So OSBA Legislative Liaison is Molly McIntosh. Our delegate is Bill Jewell. Our alternate is Kelly Milligan. Our local legislative is Molly McIntosh. Warren County is Tammy Lanehart. Curriculum is Molly and Missy. Maintenance is Bill. Athletic is Bill and Molly. Finance is Tammy and Kelly. Education is Bill and Molly. Lions is Bill. CERA is Missy and Tammy. Music is Kelly. Student Achievement is Missy. And Lioness is Tammy. If everybody is agreeable to that, then we'll need a motion for approval.
Need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Milligan, we'll need a second.
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Miller. If there's no discussion, Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
and Mr. Jewell.
Yes.
And then next, the Miami Valley CTC, their terms for their board is a 3-year term. Our last representative was Mrs. Lanehart. She's willing to continue that again as our representative, and we need approval for appointing her to a new 3-year term to the Miami Valley CTC School Board. So we'll need a motion for approval.
So moved.
First by Mrs. McIntosh,
I'll second.
second by Mrs. Miller. If there's no discussion, Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
and Mrs. Lanehart.
Abstain.
Okay, I will turn it over to you, Mr.
Okay, and we need a motion to go into a executive meeting.
Also moved.
First by Miss, who
First
was
by-
first?
Me.
First by Mrs. McIntosh.
That's what I thought. Second, I need a second
Second.
by Mrs. Lanehart.
So
Call the roll.
we have an executive session for the purpose of personnel with no action to follow.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure we were all clear. Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Milligan,
Yes.
and Mr. Jewell.
Yes.
Time in is 6:18.